development of soul's svātantrya, freedom, as it gets evolved from Rāmānuja to Deśikācharya. Deśika is, yet another milestone in the evolution of the Vishishtadvaita philosophy, and we are extremely glad and indebted to Dr. Marcus for having joined us and having kindly agreed to deliver this lecture. I welcome Dr. Marcus and all other senior professors, Professor William Sweet, other professors, Suganya is here, and all other professors, as well as youngsters who have joined this evening with us. All of you are most welcome to those lecture programs, and I'm sure with your continued support, the International School for Sri Shankaracharya Studies will be able to accomplish the task that it has pledged upon. So thank you once again, and then I welcome Dr. Marcus to deliver his lecture. Over to Marcus.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Suganya, did you succeed? Very good, fine. So I start and then I point out to the slides. Thank you. Yeah, my presentation will have maybe an unexpected approach. Looking at the act of giving and receiving, we have learned from Marcel Mauss, especially in his essay sur le don. The title is The Gift, the Form and Reason for Exchange in Archaic Societies, that the specificity of the gift consists in two essential moments. One is that the giver remains present in the gift, in what is given, and thus a force is inherent in the gift, which secondly compels the receiver to reciprocate, that means to give back. In its very successful application to India, the reciprocity has been very often criticized. It applies, but certainly not always. I would like to take up here the further development that certainly started with Marcel Mauss up to the description of the relation between God and soul as a relation of giving and receiving. Insofar as in a tradition of theistic Vedanta like Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, the relationship from God's side to the soul is predominantly described in the terminology of giving and receiving, I ask myself to what extent the act of giving is essential for God's relationship to the soul and the other way around, and in what way it can be analyzed against the background of giving and receiving. Looking at the relationship between God and soul, it is clear that it is certainly not an economic relationship of exchange in which material goods circulate. But to clarify this, let me have a few very sentences about the history of giving. A dependence based on this could perhaps be recorded for the Vedic period, I will make it very short, in which a reciprocal exchange appeared necessary. However, this reciprocity between many gods and many humans is, for example, expressed in the words Ita pradana deva upajivanti, amuda pradanam mushya upajivanti. Because of what is given from here, the gods live. Because of what is given from there, the humans live. That's the next slide. And this works as long as both parties are mutual, reliable partners. But this is not always guaranteed, thank you. To ensure that a giving act fulfills its purpose and produces the appropriate result, the offerings to the gods are replaced by ritual. The ritual action fulfills its purpose when the desired result has been achieved. However, the ritual lacks reciprocity because the gods are no longer recipients and could not return what has been given before by the human being. The human being now, the soul, for example, has to perform the ritual unreciprocated. The first quotation is throughout many Brahmana texts, so therefore I gave no special reference. The ritual act now, further in the development, is not without any purpose. The result is always achieved. Nevertheless, one cannot decide when the result is realized. When the fulfillment of the ritual act no longer depends on the reciprocal material gift of another person or human being or another god, it depends now on its correct performance. Such a correct performance presupposes the correct understanding of the Veda, whose valid sentences now, injunctions and prohibitions are eternally fixed in their meaning. Their correct understanding guarantees that the result that the agent, now the Khatri, who is the logical subject of every action, produces by performing the ritual act. An important innovation that becomes clear now is independence, already expressed by Panini, which is, for example, here in the Ashtadhyayi, the sentence, the sutra Svātantrya Karta. The agent is the one who is independent. So the idea of independency, freedom, here I tend, and throughout I will translate svātantrya and svātantra as independent. Of course, it has this connotation of freedom. The performance of the sacrificial act is based now on one's own mind. Later we have the term svabuddhi. One is independent and yet at the same time bound to the injunction of the Vedic instruction. So far, we can say, in a long development, at first a shift took place from a multitude of gods to ritual, and finally to the eternal Veda as an independent authority guaranteeing the result of action. Whatever heaven, progeny, food, wealth, power, victory, cattle should be secured earlier in the reciprocal exchange of gifts at the event of a sacrifice, that is now guaranteed by a non-reciprocal act of an independent agent. Alongside the establishment of the authority of the Veda, monotheistic traditions developed which reformulate views on giving and receiving. Here it is clearly one God who disposes the result of a ritual act or even of his worship. However, the Mīmaṅsakas' view, where the Veda is the highest authority, the Mīmaṅsakas' view of the result of a ritual act could not be pushed aside, especially since the theistically shaped traditions in particular proved the existence of God only on the basis of the Veda and not from any other means of knowledge. The contradiction is obvious. The claim to omnipotence of a God, of a monotheistic God, who is effective in all things and souls, implies that the decision about the reward, the result of a ritual action performed according to the Veda, no longer depends on the independence of the performer, but relies on God alone. It is therefore one God. It is therefore claimed that one God who it is therefore claimed that it is one God who ensures the result of human ritual, and this implies that God bestows, gives any gift. Now, in the section of the Brahma Sutra 236. Maybe Suganya, the next slide. This is the authors and works I'm relying and try to refer shortly Rāmānuja, Varadaguru, Sudarshana Suri, and Vedāntadeśika, they all provide a lot of material on the svātantrya of course, God and of the soul. The next slide is Suganya, the translation and the text of the Brahma Sutra 2.3. 33 and 40 to 41. In the section of the Brahma Sutra, I will only read the first two. The soul is an agent on account of scripture, thus having a purport. Yeah, this is for the soul, but from the highest, this being declared by scripture. This will be, the meaning will be more clear when I go on. In this section with these sutras, which deals with God as the basis of everything, Rāmānuja discusses the question whether the soul now acts under the precondition of his own intellect, svabuddhi, while following the prescription of the Veda, or does act exclusively as caused by God. If it were only dependent on God for its actions, the authority of the Veda can be called into question, which in fact enabled independency, svātantrya. But such an independency of the soul to act, however, must also be assumed. But can the individual soul dispose of his own independency, or has it to be given by God? In the discussion of the mentioned sutras, the problem is now the following. For Rāmānuja and for his followers, if there is no Vedic regulation, the acceptance of an agent would not be necessary. But if there is an agent, a khatri, independency would be implied and go against a god, who should bestow any result of ritual activity. But dependency on the Supreme alone would imply that the Shastra and affirmation, the Shastra on the Vidhi and Nisheda, on affirmation and negation, would be meaningless. This is the conflict. Rāmānuja must preserve both the authority of the Veda and the absolute concept of God. It should be explained why the individual soul can begin to act on its own initiative in order to be the addressee of a prescription of the Veda to be carried out. And at the same time, the soul must depend on God, otherwise monotheism will be useless. How does the soul obtain now the independency to act? Is it because it can act on its own initiative by svabuddhi, or is the possibility of an independent activity given to him? But is independency, svātantrya, which is given, not turning into dependency? The decisive question is this: how is independence possible for the soul so that he is the addressee of a Vedic prescription to be carried out, but at the same time acts independency of God? Rāmānuja must most important statements, and then also in greater detail Sudarshana Suri's and Venkatanata's development to this question, I will try to deal with in the following. First of all, how does Rāmānuja continue this discussion? He cites the gift of consent, anumatidana, that God gives to human action. Maybe, Suganya, you can give the next slide. Yeah, here I have exactly, again, the crucial question in the Brahma Sutra. I will read it. Is the agency of the soul due to the independency, or does agency depend on the Supreme Self? The answer is agency exists because of independency. For if agency of the soul depends on the Supreme Self, the Shastra on injunction and prohibition would be meaningless. For only he who, by virtue of his own intellect, is able to start or to cease an activity is the addressee of a Vedic regulation to be enjoined. This is exactly the problem Rāmānuja is dealing with. And the next slide shows that what I'm saying. First of all, Rāmānuja discusses and continues now this discussion and cites the gift of consent or permission, anumatidana, that God gives to human action. He says the Supreme Self, the inner ruler, promotes action by granting permission insofar as it regards the effort which is done by the soul in any activity. The meaning is activity of the soul is not possible without permission on the part of the Supreme Self. Quote end. So if the soul cannot act without God's consent or permission, why the soul's independency? Svātantrya, why is it mentioned? The individual soul begins his action out of his own will, but to act out of his own will presupposes independence, freedom to start one's own activity by my own initiative, on its own. For Rāmānuja, this is the case. With the gift of consent, God makes it possible for the living being to act independently and thus also to be the addressee of a Vedic command to be carried out. The gift of consent, anumatidana, does not speak of a counter-gift, of course, but to act with God's agreement might imply a worshipping action. We will see. How do God's consent and the soul's necessary independence relate to each other? What does God agree to? God cannot agree to nothing. He only agrees if there is already a phala, a result of action. But this would imply that an action is done by the soul while being independent, and God's consent comes afterwards. So then we have still independence at first by the soul. At the same time, it should only be God, he, who makes such an independent action, svātantrya, possible. Can you show us the next folio? Yeah, exactly. This is Patricia Mumm. For me, she is authority. And the crucial question she is giving in an article, it may be asked how this renunciation, it's a few steps further already in my direction, but she is here the contradiction beautiful expressing in the following sentence. It may be asked how this renunciation of kartritva and its fruits is to be reconciled with the previous affirmation of the jivas vinyatritva, kartritva and bhoktritva, which we say were necessary for shastraic meaningfulness. However, for Rāmānuja, this contradiction must have attracted attention because in the following interpretation and commentaries to Rāmānuja's statements, the independency of humans' activity is presupposed by God's consent. And let me show now, demonstrate with Sudarshana Suri's words that how independence of the soul's action is given by God, and how this central thought is developed. Yeah, maybe excuse me, one step in between. In the next slide, I forgot Varada Guru. He's already going in very detail, maybe a little bit further developed. He says in his Tattvasara at the beginning, he says in his Tattvasara verse 46, at the beginning of creation, the soul exists by itself through its capacity for independency, svātantrya shaktya, he says, which was given ishvaradattaya, which was given only by God, whereby the soul produces its respective recognition directed towards something, its desire to act and its effort. So here we have already a very interesting inclusion of the svātantrya Shakti into the act of giving by God. So, and the act of giving by God is, of course, something which must have absolute priority. And it's also here, maybe I can put the question, could an image of God be in another way as, so to say, a first giver? So I like to continue with the Sudarshana Suri. So far we have seen that granting the soul independence is a special step because it has to be agreed upon with the omnipotence of God. In the same way as his predecessor Rāmānuja, Sudarshana Suri in his Prakashika and also in other works has to solve the contradiction between the omnipotence of God, who on the one hand must be the permanent cause of everything, and on the other hand, the independency of the individual agent. Yeah, maybe you can already give the next slide. Dependence on God is emphasized in the sense that it is God who enables the soul to perform an action based on its own. In this sense, of course, there is dependence. At the same time, the soul is still enabled to act freely. God is therefore and must remain the agent of everything, but also gives the soul the ability to act and thus freely decide what it wants. Since the soul is given the ability by God to think, Chit Shakti, and to become active, Pravriti Shakti, it has on the one side a dependency because it must accept something which is given, but givenness also implies independence made possible by God, enabled by God. Now, a step further, the Jivatman has its own will and to strive for a good result. So here in this quotation, it is said that mere agency is based on the highest because for all souls, generally, the mental capacity and the capacity for activity and the acquirement for supporting factors, which are limbs, organs, etc., depend on the highest. And specific agency is based on the Supreme, insofar as it depends on the permission of the Supreme. We see, so there's more and more a shift to the highest as an absolute base for everything. Nevertheless, the crucial question is how to deal with the svātantrya of the soul. And here Sudarshana Suri has, in fact, I think, a special position in the development of the Vishishtadvaita. So we see the first action, Pratama Pravriti, is given by God. And generally, this first gift by God, God's gift, is the gift of independency by which the soul can begin with a Pratama Pravriti, with a first action, and then in the course of a subsequent action of the soul, God gives the gift of consent, Anumatidana. So here the conflict between Anumatidana and svātantrya is, I think, more reflected. By its own independency, the soul can choose for itself whether it acts in accordance with the Vedic regulation or whether it fails to do so. His will, its ichā also enables him to do this. It is remarkable that Sudarshana Suri repeated now several times, I give the quote in short, that independency is not to be taken away, anyavarya, if it is able to act according to its own will. So here it is possible that the soul has its own will given by God, but how exactly Sudarshana Suri explains God's relationship to its independence? Why is the first action relevant to God's relationship with the soul, and why independence can still be considered to be enabled by God? For is not independency, again, which still depend on something contradictory, still again the same question? Now, in order to avoid any contradiction, Sudarshana Suri refers, you can give the next slide. Here I have only the sentence, and freedom of the soul, svātantrya, is not to be destroyed if it is able to act according to its own will. This is, I think, a very, and Sudarshana Suri is repeating this repeating this central sentence. Now, in order to avoid any contradiction, Sudarshana Suri refers to the fact that God restrains himself from this first action of the soul. He uses, as Rāmānuja before in his Vedanta Sangraha, but not in the Shrivāshya, the term audāsinya, which I translate as indifference or neutrality, which describes God's distant attitude to the first action, pratama pravriti, of the soul. Only because God keeps himself back, humans can, or the soul can act freely. Audāsinya, if you look in the Sankhya Karika, Udāsina is a description for the Purusha. Interestingly, of course, Audāsinya is in the Bhagavad Gita mentioned. And it is interesting that this allusion maybe to Sankhya philosophy is here to characterize God as someone who is distant in the first, against the first action of the soul. So, but why does God have to express indifferency? Audāsinya. Sudarshana Suri replies that God has no special intention in soul's first activity, abhisandhi vishesha abhava. Nevertheless, God's attitude towards the soul changing with the following action, the uttara or dvitiya pravriti. Insofar as God is directed at something in the second act, his recognition has then now an objective content on the basis of which he reflects, God reflects the result or the phala of the soul's previous first activity. The first gift of freedom for the soul now, of course, is not taken away if God himself receives the result of this action. And the complex process between independency and the first result of action, which God agrees to, is described by Sudarshana Suri in the next slide in the following words. Concerning, I think this is really fascinating, this relation concerning even the first wish or will and its first effort, the soul is one whose freedom is not to be destroyed. We know this sentence, but here it is again repeated in another place. And the Supreme Self is indifferent, udāsina, against these two of wish, will, and effort of the soul, because it is in this relation to the soul without concrete intention. This was my abhisandhi vishesha abhava. And in the second desire and its effort, the Supreme Self is characterized by a concrete intention, and it gathers in its cognition an objective content from nowhere, even if it has not been produced by any other preceding cause. So, and then he continues, the appearance of the objective content in the next slide is a special support. It therefore takes the form of a gift. Yeah, it takes the form of a gift, paladana rupa, of the result for the first action of the living being. Even at this time, the highest for the individual living being destroys, he repeats, nothing that could take its own will, etc. away. Therefore, there is still independency. Yeah, atas tasya svātantrya, there's still independency for the soul. Quote end. The peculiarity of God's gift of freedom lies in the fact that God makes it possible by withdrawing in such a way that he gives the soul, let me say, space to act independent. Yeah, so it is God, in fact, who is giving space to be independent. The fact that God, next slide, withdraws himself, or as the next quote says, remains silent, interestingly, tushniphava, does not diminish the value of freedom or independency, but rather confirms it. So Sudarshana Suri continues. He further applies Kimcha. After God has given mental ability and the ability to act, and for the soul independency, whose characteristic is that it cannot be taken away, insofar as it is characterized by an ability of the will, then occurs the silence of God in the first activity of the soul. And this does not mean a fault of the independence, but rather serves God's excellence. Yeah. So this situation is in fact characterizing God's excellence, even if he is silent, even if he has no special abhisandhi. So, of course, God's gift of freedom does not need to be accepted, but can also be misused by man to act badly. This is also considered. Rāmānuja, but Rāmānuja admits that God would be able, in fact, to hold humans back from bad, from papa karma, from bad acts. And for Sudarshana Suri, it is also not a mistake that maybe a soul can act badly if God also agrees to bad deeds. Even if God restrains itself with the first action, he gives nevertheless the result of every first action. But this is also described, he punishes no bad acting. Let me come to Vedāntadeśika. Vedāntadeśika deals with this subject in very detail. In several chapters and sections of his works devoted to different topics, he does not. He deals in several chapters and sections of his works, which are devoted to different topics. And he does not criticize the discussion of his predecessors, but he, let me say, expands these topics step by step, either by summarizing the arguments or by picking out different aspects and elaborating them according to the respective context. In this sense, he not only develops the concept of God further by expanding the basic thesis of his tradition that God as the inner ruler carries and directs all souls and the worlds, he also in no way diminishes the status of the soul in its relation to God. For him, too, it is the soul, it is a being with, I think, with irreducible spirituality, which is at the same time granting and enabling an a priori agency and thus an independent being. in the next slide. An example of this is found in the Nyaya Siddhanjana, here in a separate detailed chapter on the soul. He proves it with a reference to sutra, to the mentioned sutra 2333 and 2340, after determining the knowership of the soul as an inherent nature, with reference to Brahma Sutra 2319, which is for the same reason, namely because of scriptures, the self is not mere knowledge, but the knower, the country. Vedāntadeśika states here that the agency, which is the cause of being enjoyer, belongs to the self, the enjoyer, and that agency is generally caused by the Supreme Person. This is explained in detail in the section beginning with the sutra. The self, being the enjoyer, is the agent because of scriptures, have a purport only in that case, and that beginning with the sutra, but the doership or the agency of the individual self is from the Supreme Para, from the Supreme Brahman, because Shrutis mention it, or mention of it, because the Shrutis mention of it. So, however, in order to illustrate the relationship between the soul and God for Venkatanatha, for here in the Nyaya Siddhanjana, it is only confirmed that the soul as an agent depends on God for its being, and therefore I would like to refer to more passages in his work where our topic is taken up and further elaborated by Venkatanatha in one aspect or another. Of course, the Adhikarana Saravali I skipped here, but is very important, but I see I have some time still. Would like to give just a few words, because the Adhikarana Saravali is the Shribhashya to is the commentary to the Shribhashya, and one could follow here at first the line more than in other of his works. In the line of the commentary tradition, of course, the Adhikarana Saravali is deepening Vedāntadeśika's exposition. He emphasizes that God gives the soul the corresponding results of their actions, that is clear, and souls, for him, of course, conscious beings, act differently because of their karma, which produces results, and God gives the respective results of the action in accordance with the past actions. This is explicitly said in the Adhikarana Saravali, especially in the section where of these mentioned sutras. His bestowal of results is determined. Now two new concepts come in, central key terms: compassion and equality. So karuna and samya, equality or egalitarism, something like samya. So he is also try to treat everything in an equal way. He mentions, of course, this concept of samya in several, also in the Tattvamukta Kalapa, for example, in the Nayakasara. God clearly acts in the sense of the soul and wants to prevent it from suffering further. This is also emphasized in the Adhikarana Saravali. At the same time, the soul cannot be deprived of all the autonomy of his own actions. Also, this is emphasized in Deśika. And one point which is also very interesting in the Adhikarana Saravali is that of course, Vedāntadeśika is aware that God has an own will, and he is also aware that the souls have an own will. And so these icha cannot be the same. And he also comments on this by pointing out that everything depends exclusively on God's own will, yeah, whereas the soul itself depends only on its own will, which of course precedes the action and nothing else. This is, I think, also a point which is not so elaborated in other works as I know, but of course God has an own will, and he is preserving, in fact, this main and central thesis of Sudarshana Suri, that the own will of the individual cannot be taken away, cannot be destroyed, but this should also not contradict God's own highest will, by which everything is in fact caused. In the next, he becomes then very elaborate in the, oh, this is not so good to see, but maybe I will read it quickly. This is then because Rāmānuja is very detailed in the Sri Bhashya. He is also detailed in the Vedanta Sangraha to exactly this topic, and he is, of course, in the Charama Shloka, in his commentary to the Charama Shloka in Gita Bhashya, in his Gita Bhashya, also very detailed. And then comes Vedāntadeśika with his Tatpaya Chandrika. And he is now enumerating a lot, really a lot of characteristics which are or go back on God's initiative. And this is very interesting because you see at first the bestowal of limbs and organs which are capable of acting as intended by one's own will, like a machine. This is by God, the state of being situated as the support of all by his own nature and wish, by his conformability to all action and inaction, like the earth. This is also by God. The presentation of external objects on which action depends is also by God. Bestowing of the capacity on which limbs, organs, etc. rest. All these are of the Lord in the last line. All this is in accord with the soul's agency and is common to action and inaction. So, and now very interesting is the next slide. Then he's telling at the time of action of a person who has obtained power in this way, the Lord's being the permitter is in order for action to be effective. And then the last sentence, very important, tat apina jivasya kartritam varayati, even this does not invalidate the soul's agency. So God in his giving is overwhelming, but he is not giving up, he's not sublating the kartritva of the jiva. So I nearly come to the end. It is important to see that all these initiatives attributed to God are all attributed to God, and there are more and more of them. And but they, for Vedāntadeśika, should nevertheless not diminish the individuality of the soul. He therefore repeats, of course, several times that all these are of the Lord. All this is in accord. What God gives to the soul is in accord with the soul's agency and is common to action and inaction. Maybe two little examples, because it is interesting. In other works of Vedāntadeśika, namely the Paramatta Bhanga and the Rahasyatraya Sara, that he is also discussing extensively this relation between soul and God, and he devotes an own little part in the Paratattva Adhikara in the Paramatta Bhanga, where he is discussing the contradiction that God is indifferent, his audacinia, but must be the cause of everything. So how this contradiction could be solved. And interesting is of course, the role of the Shastra here. In the next slide, the Shastra is applicable because the souls acquire agency, independence from the highest, and it is not incorrect to get for the one who is not omniscient, the soul, knowledge, which depends on instruction, and for the one who is incapable of everything, agency, which depends on the highest. So also here, everything is given for the soul by God. And the last maybe quotation of the Rahasya Sara before I summarize my as it is affirmed, he says in the Vedanta Sutras, and here again we have the quotation of the two sutras, the soul is an agent on account of scripture, thus having a purpose, but from the highest, this being declared by scripture, even if there is for the soul agency depending on the Lord, there is no fault in enjoining something to the soul. Taking and bearing this much independency for the soul is now the boundary or the limit of the dependency on the Lord. So I think this is Vedāntadeśika's answer on a position which goes more in maybe the Tengelai direction, which where Vedāntadeśika shows that there is a contradiction if one learns from scripture the svātantrya of the soul, one cannot reject scripture. Yeah, and for scripture, I need the khatri, the agent, the individual soul, which cannot be reduced. So, at least concerning the question of release, if one relinquishes agency to get release, one cannot do this without agency. This is the problem. Even in salvation, Vedāntadeśika insists that jiva kartritva applies. And the kartritva tyaga, the giving up of agency, is therefore not a denial of the jiva kartritva. It is an affirmation because it is a presupposition with all the already mentioned implications. In all the performances of prapatti, of kainkarya, and in bhakti, there is for Vedāntadeśika kartritva, which is dependent on the Lord. And because agency can never be denied, the kartritva tyaga is for Vedāntadeśika, he says, only a mental relinquishment. It is the awareness of one's own dependence solely on the Lord, which is co-eternal with the soul, which means that one's kartritva comes about based on him. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marcus, for that wonderful presentation. It was indeed a treat wherein he was presenting the dichotomy, as it were. On one side, you have the svātantrya of the self, which has to be retained in order to engage the kartrutva, bhoktrutva, and the jnatrutva. And on this other side, the principle of paratantrya, which is, the fundamental principle in the Vishishtadvaita coupled with kainkarya and the other principles. So how these two can go together, and we also, he has beautifully presented the evolution of those scholars attending keenly on both these principles, retaining both these principles, keeping a balance between these two, as it were, without one, without sacrificing one at the cost of the other, retaining both the principles. Because as you all know that if you sacrifice the principle of agentship, well then, as he has initially said, Shastras carry no meaning, because here the agent has nothing to do. because it is all Lord who determines everything. And at the same time, if the agent is all free to perform his actions, then what is the dependency that the Sheshi Sambandha is ruled out? The fundamental principles of Vishishtadvaita get sacrificed. So it is this paradoxical notions, apparently conflicting principles, which have been handled. It's indeed fascinating. He has drawn the evolution from Rāmānuja through Sudarshana Suri to the Varadaraja Guru and to Deshikar, who is marked as Kavitarkika Simhaha. All as beautiful works. We can enumerate any number of works which are wonderful. There is no one who was born to defeat Deshikar in his philosophical exegesis. And I loved you speaking about the growing tendency, as it were, from Rāmānuja through Sudarshana Suri. When you come to Varadaraja Guru, the growing tendency to establish Lord's will over the individual's freedom, or the svātantrya, and discussing how far God allots space for the jiva to act, and it be the gift from God. And the various works, he has referred to almost all major works of all these scholars he has attended to, particularly of Vedāntadeśika, innumerable works, the famous works like Tattva-mukta Kalapa, and almost all the works he has referred to. So probably I could start the discussion by just commenting on this. You did make a mention of the Charama Shloka of Bhagavad Gita, where dependency has been encouraged by Bhagavad Gita, and it is one text that encourages a lot of dependency as far as the Shruti literature is concerned. So as I say it, probably Vishishtadvaita, as we know, what Rāmānuja basically started doing was, bringing in the Pancharatra tradition and also the Vedanta Vichara Riti. So in Vedanta, there is this tendency to credit freedom, agentship to the individual, because the basic sutras and the Upanishads are there. But at the same time, when you come to the Vaishnava tradition, the classical Vaishnava tradition, this dependency to Lord is being projected. So probably that is the reason why, bringing these two together, as Rāmānuja has classically done. From Vedanta, he has interpreted Vedanta in tune with the Vaishnavite tradition. So now, do you ever think that, this Vedanta philosophies were trying to take, or was superseding the Vaishnavite streams of thinking, or was the Vedanta philosophies restricting Rāmānuja to, come out fully with the Vaishnavite philosophies? Because, in Vedanta tradition, you have the agentship, which has been projecting, because it is hardcore philosophy. And on the other hand, you have the Vaishnavite tradition, which speaks about, the Paratantra is something which is enjoyable and which is encouraged, where the agent no more feels sorry that he is dependent on the Lord. So the question is, barring Bhagavad Gita, in none of the Shruti texts, this dependency of God has been encouraged. So, of course, you have, as you have rightly said, Bhagavad Gita is one classical text. But other than that, you don't find anything in the Shruti. But a lot in the Vaishnava tradition. So, how do you see this? Like when I suggest that probably Rāmānuja's hands, and also, the struggle is largely due to this amalgamation of Vedanta with the Vaishnava tradition. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. You have, I'm very happy you have all the relevant central points of my paper, and really I'm very glad. Let me emphasize my introduction, because I try to develop this thinking from the viewpoint of giving and receiving. And this is still, the gift is something very central also in this religious philosophy. And you need two, you need two, in fact. You need always two. And if you see the development of svātantrya from the deconstruction of the many gods, about which, in fact, I read the work of Frank Clooney in this direction. He's showing how these devatas are deconstructed, and this, I think, is a rational step. Is a step in thinking the individuality, the svātantrya of the sacrificer, which has not now the ability for reciprocity of goods. He is alone, and he depends on the right understanding of the Veda. So I think these are all steps which are not giving up. And if you have the Vedanta tradition, they can also not give a cut between these kinds of succession and succeeding insights in Indian thinking. So individuality, and let me say subjectivity in its best, and irreducibility of subjectivity is in fact the question in every soteriological thinking. And therefore Rāmānuja is of course criticizing the Mimamsa tradition, and he is of course confronted with the growing monotheism, which started with the Divya Prabandham and maybe already before, after Christ, with Shvetashvatara Upanishad and so on. But this is also a very interesting point, that individuality against God cannot be given up, and it is, if you see Paratantriya in the Tengalite tradition, it is leveled down, in fact. So you have not this kind of individuality and subjectivity in the Tengalite tradition. You have they are at pain to differentiate between Prapatti and Bhakti, while for Vedāntadeśika he is identifying the Rahasyatraya Sara, if I'm not wrong. He's not identifying, he's not saying this is the same, but he is not giving such a deep difference like the Tengalite tradition would do it. So there is another view on individuality and subjectivity, which is not inferior than Vedāntadeśika, but more radical, I think so. And you have, in fact, the paradox that God in the Tengalite tradition maybe is giving only something to himself, and not to someone, which could, of course, decide in another way. You have also the insight in Vedāntadeśika and his predecessors that the individual can decide to do something evil. The will also is in this way free to make a choice between only for God or for something else. And even then God is there and would help in the next kalpa the jiva to get out of the samsara. So of course, Pancharatra, you say this is ritual, and Pancharatra could be included because you have somebody who performs the ritual, and this is the subject, and the individual. And so the ritualistic traditions are very important to improve individuality, I would say.
Thank you. Now the floor is open for discussion. I see Saji here, Suganya. Yes, the floor is open for discussion. I think Suganya has left because she said she will have to leave early.
Yeah, Suganya already left. No problem.
She had to leave. Yeah, that's it. So, is there any question from, or
I
are there
think one is
questions
there.
in the chat box?
One is there. One vote.
Ah. Yeah, please go ahead if you locate any question in the chat box.
Yes.
There are no questions. No questions.
Hi, madam.
No.
Good evening. Good evening, Professor Marcus. Wonderful to hear you speak. Madam Srikala Nair, good evening. This is Saji here from Shillong. Yeah, madam, I have always been associating closely Rāmānuja's Vishishtadvaita with our tradition, Cartesian tradition in the Western philosophy. Do you see some similarities of that kind, especially with regards to the dichotomy that he makes between the mind and matter? Do you, Professor Marcus, do you see in the Dvaita, in the tradition of being Dvaita of Rāmānuja, such kind of a distinction? The whole sorts of subsequent theories that emerged in Western philosophy after Cartesian thinking, which emerged, could all be traced back to this dichotomy that he drew between mind and matter. Do you see an emergence of such thoughts which could also be linked to this Dvaita theory of Rāmānuja? Do you have you seen any subsequent traditions emerging which could be a focal point in Indian philosophy where we see a diversion of thoughts, of thinking, which could be that the Brahman as a unity where mind and matter are rather distinct from each other? Thank you.
Yes, Marcus. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. This is a very good question because if you collect all the parts of the work, especially by Vedāntadeśika, which deal with the concept of Bheda, yeah, the concept of difference, the concept of distinction, yeah, you have already preformed the fivefold doctrine, Madhva doctrine of Bheda in Vedāntadeśika. The Bheda between, of course, the souls, each other, the Bheda between soul and matter, the Bheda between God and soul, and the Bheda between God and inconstant entities. So they are fully aware that, and of course they are criticizing the Advaita tradition immensely of their refutation of the Bheda, which has in a very, very deep view some common thoughts, and the Vishishtadvaitins learned already a lot from the Advaitic refutation of the thesis that there is no Bheda. Yeah? So to prove, of course, the Advaita, but to have this deep insight of difference between something immaterial and something which is only conscious, I think this is a very difficult question, which is, in fact, if you see the development after Descartes, not solved. Yeah, Kant is leaving open from where this difference is coming, and we cannot prove it by any reason. Yeah, he's showing that there are differences, that are distinctions that we cannot overcome, and we cannot give any rational reason. And this is a very interesting parallel for me with also the Vedanta tradition, because also the Vedāntadeśika is saying the Veda is svā-nirvāhaka, he is accomplishing itself. And of course he is saying svā-para-nirvāhaka, the Veda is giving the reason for manifoldness, that there are different things, but you cannot have an insight in the Veda of the Veda. You cannot know by your pratyaksha the Veda of the Veda. Yeah, so the Veda is in fact something which comes that is there by itself. So Madhva, of course, is deepening this insight. Maybe he's also, I don't know from where he's influenced, but he's not saying svā-para-nirvāhaka, he's only saying svā-nirvāhaka. Yeah, a very, very deep difference. Maybe you can also look to Derrida's Différence, where you see that there is something which is there, and you have to take it for your thinking.
Thank you. Dr. Ravindra Venkate?
Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Good evening, sir. I want to ask Miss Paratantra and Svatantra means related to soul and this God means I am the individual soul. Whether I'm in part means I am dependent means in Paratantra related to God or related to the world. How to become independent of it? Means whether I have to become independent of this world or this I have to depend upon the God.
Let me say that a little bit more in my interpretation, that Vedāntadeśika is seeing that God enables svātantrya for the soul. This is the limit, so to say, the kashta, where so far goes paratantrya. Yeah? In this way, the soul is dependent on God, insofar as God is enabling svātantrya for the soul. Yeah? In this way, one has to understand the concept of God, which is very interesting also if you go to our tradition of pre-reflectivity, for example, yeah, which is connected with philosophy of religions of maybe Fichte or some other persons. Sorry, yes, please.
Sir, means whatever happening now, means God is facilitating us to talk. Means we are dependent on Him. Means whatever happening to us, to individual soul.
Yeah, no, not everything. Only the svātantrya. I can, and you see the ichcha. My will should not be. If I have a will for something, it should not be destroyed. It could be a good will, according to Kant.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
That's it. Is there any other question to Marcus? If not, then Shiba, shall we wind up the session?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Is there an official vote of thanks? If not, then I will deliver it. Is there an official vote of thanks? Or else I will deliver it.
Okay, ma'am. Okay.
All right.
This one.
Okay. This floor has become a platform for discussion on Vishishta Advaita, one of the living traditions of our Vedanta streams. What is unique of Vishishtadvaita when compared to Advaita Vedanta is that it has succeeded in making inroads into the lived world of the people, particularly that of the South. And that is how it succeeded in living, having a real life in the lived world of the people here. As I have indicated a little early, it has made its impact in various fine art forms, be it music, dance, sculpture, painting, and these are the ways in which a philosophy can make inroads into the live life of people, and to that extent, uh, the initiation made by great Acharya Rāmānuja himself was so successful that he has had Shishya Parampara traditions which extend up to 21st century. Even today, there are people who live and die for Vishishtadvaita philosophy, and we rarely find such kind of commitment. With all respect to Shankara, we rarely find such commitment to Advaita Vedanta. And this is what makes Vishishtadvaita stand up amidst all the other traditions of Vedanta. As we know, Vedanta has given rise to various streams of thinking, including the Purnadvaita that we have had in the 20th century by Sri Aurobindo. So various streams of thought that has born out of the granthas, the three major granthas. Vishishtadvaita has this unique factor, of course, which is slightly been shared by the Dvaita doctrine also, where it is strong in its philosophy and is equally strong in impacting the lived world of the people. We are indeed grateful, Marcus, for you having joined us and spoken about this wonderful philosophy and reminded us. Thank you so much. We are indebted. Please join in our text reading sessions as well. We would love to read. We have already had a reading on Sri Bhashya, and we would like to read more on Deshika's work because Deshika's works are tough. So we need really scholarly people to read on that. But nevertheless, we have that in mind. So we'll let you know. Please extend continued cooperation for International School of Sri Shankaracharya Studies, and do come to India whenever time permits. And you are most welcome to Kaladi. It's the birthplace of Shankaracharya. I thank one and all for this cooperation that has been extended, the continued cooperation that we have been receiving from the scholarly community across the globe. A lot of things do happen in the internet, and you'll have to make your choices as to where you will have to join. But then we are glad that a lot of scholars do join our forum and do give us continued support. And for this evening, it is a goodbye, and then we will meet again and we will let you know our programs for the next month. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Teacher, I think Dr. Marcus has visited our university.
He has visited. You have visited Kaladi prior?
No.
He has visited. You have been to Chennai for Mishra's conference, is it?
Yeah.
When I have forwarded this, then Professor Indra was telling me that he has visited Chennai, University of Madras, responding to Professor Mishra's 1000-year celebration of Srimad Rāmānuja. Right?
Yeah.
So you are most welcome to Kaladi as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.